Take my ox. Let my wife birth indoors, and the animal is yours." The words came out of the dark with the snow, and for a breath Gideon Mercer could not find the man who had said them. Then the lantern found him. A drifter, hat brim loaded white, one glove wrapped in a lead rope, and at the end of that rope a black ox stood steaming in the storm. Behind the man was a woman with both hands pressed under the swell of her belly, and behind her was nothing but the first true blizzard of the year, come down off Coldwater Pass an hour after dusk. Gideon had opened his door to the sound of a beast bawling in his yard. He had expected a lost steer. He had not expected a stranger offering him everything the stranger owned. He would think of that ox many times before the winter let go. He would think of it when the passes filled and the horses stood useless in their stalls, when every road in the valley closed but one, when the only track still open was the flat lane a black ox had packed with his own weight. But that came later. On this first night, there was only the cold, and a hard bargain held out across a threshold, and a man deciding whether to answer it. "You don't know me," the drifter said. "I know it. But she can't birth in the wagon. She's been in her pains since noon, and the roof canvas froze through an hour back." Gideon looked past him to the woman. She did not beg. That was the thing he marked. She stood straight with the snow whitening her shawl, and looked at him as a person looks at weather, waiting to learn what it would do. "An ox," Gideon said. "He's sound. 6 years, broke to yoke and to load. He'll pull a stump or a sledge or a full rick of hay, and he'll do it slow, and he'll do it steady, and he won't quit on you." The drifter's voice cracked once, and he pushed through it. "He's the last thing I have that's worth anything. I'm giving him to you for a corner by your fire. That's the whole of it." The wind came around the corner of the house and drove snow flat between them. Somewhere out past the barn a shutter began to knock. Gideon Mercer was 40 years old, and he had learned to be careful with his door. He had buried a wife and a day-old son on this place 3 winters gone. In ground he'd had to thaw with a fire before the spade would take it, and since then he had kept his gate shut and his talk short. Strangers cost. Kindness cost more. He knew both prices to the penny. He almost said no. He had the word ready in his mouth. It was the sensible word, the one that kept a roof sound and a stack whole and a man clear of other folks' ruin, and he had lived 3 hard years by it. "I've no room for strangers," Gideon said. "Try the Halloran place, down the road a mile. They keep a bigger house." I stopped at the Halloran place. Elias did not raise his voice. "And 2 doors before it. Every house on this road is barred tonight, and yours was the last light I could see through the snow." His grip tightened on the frozen rope. "I'm not asking you to keep us. I'm asking you to let a child come under a roof instead of under a wagon sheet. 1 night. After that, the animal is yours, and we go at the first break in the sky." But he knew the other thing, too. He knew what a woman sounded like when the cold got into a birth, and the birth started to go wrong. He had heard it once, in this house, and he had not been able to stop it. "The ox is mine, then," Gideon said. "Whatever this night turns into, whatever comes of her in that bed, I keep him, and you are owed nothing from me after. Say it plain, so there is no misremembering it come the thaw. He is yours," Elias said. "Bought and paid. I will not ask him back." Gideon looked one more moment at the black ox, standing patient in the blowing snow, and shut the bargain in his own mind before he shifted from the doorway. "Bring her in," Gideon said. "Put the ox in the byre, the near stall, out of the wind. Then get back here and shut my door behind you." The drifter's name was Elias Kane, and his wife was Naomi, and the ox, he said, was called Samson. Gideon did not ask for the names. Elias gave them anyway, needing the stranger to know they were real people and not a tail that would blow off with the storm. They got Naomi across the yard between them. She walked as far as she could, and then she could not. And Gideon took her weight against his side and felt how cold she had gone through the wet wool. Inside, the front room was low and warm, a good stove ticking in the corner, and a kettle already near the boil. He steered her to the box bed built into the wall, and she went down onto it with a long breath that turned, at the end, into something clenched and private. "How long since the pains came close?" Gideon asked. "They're close now," Naomi said. "They've been close a while. I didn't want to say it out there and have him carry me." Elias came back in from the byre stamping snow, and stopped short at the look of her, and for a moment the drifter who had bargained so steady on the step went white and useless. Gideon put a hand flat on his chest. "You banked that ox down with hay?" "I did." "Then you've done your part with him. Now you do this. Fill both kettles from the barrel, not the trough, the barrel water's cleaner. Build the stove up till the top plate reddens. And find me every clean cloth in that chest by the window." Gideon crouched and dragged the chest out with his boot. "You hear me, Cain. Work keeps a man from being afraid. I'll thank you to be afraid later." It steadied Elias to be told. Most men it does. Outside, the storm sat down over the valley and did not get up. Gideon had seen bad first storms before, ones that came hard and blew out by morning and left the grass bent but green underneath. This was not one of those. This one had weight. He could hear it changing the shape of his yard, packing the snow up the north wall of the barn, filling the low lane to the road a handful of inches with every hour. And he knew even then, kneeling by a stranger's laboring wife, that the pass behind them had already closed and would not open again until a thaw that was months off. The birth went most of the night. There is no gentling of that kind of work, and Gideon did not try to gentle it. He had helped calves and foals into the world by the score, and once, terribly, he had tried to help his own child and failed. And everything he had learned that awful night he used now. He kept Naomi warm. He kept the water clean and near. He watched the color of her and the sound of her, and when the labor stalled and fear came into the room like a draft, he made her look at him and breathe on his count, slow, while Elias held her hands and said her name over and over as if it were a rope he was pulling her up on. Near the low point of the night the storm found the chimney, and the stove drew wrong and smoked, and Gideon got up, cracked the leeward window a thumb's width to feed the fire air, and wedged a wet cloth along the sill so the cold came in thin and clean and did not flood the room. Draw and drought, in and out. He had built the flue on this house himself, and he knew how to make it breathe against a wind. Small thing. It kept the air good for her through the worst hours, and small things, that winter, would turn out to be everything. But the child did not come, and did not come, and near the turn of the night the labor caught on something and held. Naomi's strength was draining out of her into the cold. Gideon washed his hands in warm water off the stove and felt, careful, and found the trouble. A shoulder had hung. The baby had turned wrong at the last gate. "Listen to me," he told her, level, though his own heart was slamming against his ribs. "The next pain, you do not push. You breathe, and you let me work. Do you hear me, Naomi? Do not push." She heard him. Between two pains, with Elias gripping her hands and the fire roaring against the stoveplate, Gideon worked his hand in and turned the small shoulder free. Slow. The same patient pressure he would use on a calf come wrong. No snatch in it, and no hurry. Then the next pain took her, and this time he told her to bear down with all she had left. And she did. The child came near dawn, in the blue hour when the storm went briefly quiet as storms will, gathering, a girl, small and furious and alive. And when she cried the sound went through Gideon Mercer like a spike. because it was the sound he had waited 3 years to hear in this room, and had thought he never would. Naomi held her daughter and wept without any noise. Elias put his face down against his wife's hair and shook. And Gideon stood back from the bed, at the cold edge of the lamplight, and found he had to turn away and see to the stove that did not need seeing to. By full light the valley was gone. He went out to break ice on the trough, and stood a moment in a world rubbed out and made over. The snow had stopped near dawn, and left behind a country he did not recognize, drifted smooth and deep, fence posts gone under, the barn roof carrying a foot of white with a curl at the eave like a wave that had decided not to fall. The road to Larkspur, 12 miles down the valley, was a suggestion under 3 feet of snow. Coldwater Pass above him was a solid white wall. Nothing moved out there. Nothing would move out there, he understood, that could not move itself through snow to the chest. In the near stall, warm and dry where Elias had banked him, the black ox turned his big head and looked at Gideon over the rail and went on chewing. Gideon fed him. He forked down hay from his own winter rick, the tall stack he had cut and cured through August to carry 40 head of cattle to spring, and he stood there with the fork in his hands and did the plain arithmetic of it. Every forkful into the ox was a forkful off his herd. He had cut hay for cattle, not for a stranger's beast. A hard man would have turned the ox out and let the winter take it, and kept the feed for his own. Gideon forked down a second armful and watched the ox eat it, and did not turn him out. For 3 days the storm came back in waves, and there was nothing to do but keep the stove fed and the animals watered, and stay out of the small distances between 4 people shut in one warm room. Naomi mended fast, faster than Gideon liked to hope for, and the baby nursed and slept. Elias was quiet and useful. He mucked the byre without being asked, resplit the wood down to a size the stove liked, and mended a cracked hame on Gideon's own harness by lamplight, neat, a man who knew his hands. On the 4th day the sky cleared to a hard bright blue, and the cold came down behind it like a lid. It was the kind of cold that squeals underfoot and freezes the hair inside a man's nose at the first breath, and it turned the loose deep snow into something firmer. Wind packed on top and rotten underneath, the worst footing there is. Gideon went to check his cattle in the home pasture, and found them huddled and gaunt in the lee of the windbreak, ribs starting to show, and he understood the shape of the winter he was in. His herd was alive, but the hay that would keep them alive was not all here. Half his cured hay stood in a second rick out on the north bench, better than a mile off, where he had stacked it in the fall to feed the cattle he meant to winter up there. That distance, in summer, was a nothing walk. Now it was 1.25 miles of drift, some of it packed hard, some of it belly deep and soft, with the buried creek crossing somewhere in the middle under snow that would tell a man nothing about the ice below. He tried it first with the horses. He owned 2, a good stout team, and he hitched them to the light sledge and pointed them at the bench, and he did not get a 1/4 mile. A horse in deep snow is a brave animal spending itself to death. His team hit the first real drift and lunged, both of them, chest high, plunging and blowing, throwing snow. And in 3 great heaves they were mired to the shoulder, and shaking, and no farther on than a man could have walked. A horse fights the drift. It rears up and comes down through the crust and rears again, and it will do that until its heart gives out, and it will not learn. Gideon backed them out before they hurt themselves, and stood breathing steam in the terrible bright cold, and knew his horses could not save his cattle. Elias had come out to the fence line and watched all of it. When Gideon led the blown horses back, he did not say anything smart. He waited until the team was stalled and rubbed down, and then he said, "Yoke the ox." Gideon looked at him. A horse fights the snow, Elias said. Samson leans on it. He'll not plunge and he'll not panic. Point him at a drift and he puts his brisket into it and packs it down and takes one slow step and packs the next, and he'll pull a loaded sledge the whole way and never lift into a lunge. He's cloven-hoofed, so his feet splay and find bottom where a horse's hoof cuts through. And he's got the one thing your team hasn't got out there. He almost smiled. He's got all the patience in the world. They yoked the black ox to the sledge in the blue cold, and Gideon watched a thing he would tell about for the rest of his life. The ox walked into the first drift as if the drift were a door. He set his shoulders, dropped his head, and pushed, low and even, no fight in it at all. And the snow gave and packed, and he took a step. Then another. Where the horses had spent themselves in 3 lunges and gone nowhere, the ox went forward at the pace of a man strolling, breasting a shelf of packed snow ahead of him. And behind him the sledge runners rode up onto the track he'd made, and slid easy and flat. Elias walked at his head, and Gideon walked at the sledge, and near the buried creek Elias stopped the ox with a word, and would not let him take the crossing straight. He quartered him along the bank, testing, until he found where the drift lay thickest, and the ice beneath would be firmest. And only then did he bring the big animal across, one slow, packed step at a time. They reached the north bench with the sun still up. They loaded the sledge with hay off the far rick, cinched it down with rope, and the ox brought the whole heavy load home over the flat track he had made going out, and the Mercer cattle ate that night. Gideon stood in the byre after dark and watched the black ox eat, and understood that his whole notion of the winter had turned over. He had thought himself shut in, sentenced, a man who would spend the cold months keeping 4 walls between his cattle and the grave. He was not shut in. Standing in the byre stall, chewing hay off another man's giving, was the one key that fit the whole locked country. The snow that stopped every horse and wagon and sled did not stop this animal. It only slowed him to a walk. And a walk, Gideon was coming to see, might be enough to carry a valley over to the good side of spring. He came to know the animal that winter as he had never known his horses. A working ox in that cold burned through hay like a stove burns pine, and Gideon rationed it careful, so much for the pull and so much for the standing. He waxed the sledge runners with tallow each morning, so they would not freeze down to the track in the night. He learned how far the beast could go in a day, and still eat and rest and rise to go again. He came to know the ox as he had once meant to know a son. Word of a thing like that does not stay on one ranch. There were no telephones in that valley, and no clear roads, but there were boys on snowshoes, and there was smoke that could be read, and inside a week the whole country from the pass to the town knew that Mercer had a black ox that could go where nothing else could go. The Renfro place was the first to send. They were 3 miles down the bench, a young couple with 4 small children and a 5th coming, and they had burned through their wood and were feeding their last hay in handfuls, rationing it, watching the stack go down and the winter show no sign of turning. The oldest Renfro boy came the 3 miles on webs, sank to the hip twice, and arrived at Gideon's door blue-lipped and crying and unable at first to say his own name. Gideon read all of it before the boy got a word out. "Elias," he said. They yoked the ox in the dark before dawn, and this time Gideon threw 2 of his own hay bales onto the sledge before they started, and did not say anything about it. And Elias did not either. They broke the 3 miles to the Renfro place with the ox-packing trail the entire way, and they left the Renfros with hay for a week and wood enough to keep the little ones warm. And the young mother stood in her door with a baby on her hip and could not speak for the crying. Walking home behind the empty sledge, Elias said, "Quiet, that's your hay you're giving away. Off your own herd." "I know whose hay it is," Gideon said. Your 40 head have to eat too. I've done the sum, Cain. Gideon walked a while. The cold burned in his chest. I did it the first morning, forking down feed to your ox. Every armful he eats and every bale he hauls off comes out of my own stock's mouths, and my margin to spring gets thinner by the day. I know the price of this to the pound. He looked at the ox breasting the track ahead of them, slow and enormous and steady. I'm choosing to pay it. There's a difference. That was the truest thing Gideon Mercer had said aloud in 3 years, and he was surprised to hear himself say it to a stranger. The winter did not turn. It bore down. January came in colder than December, and February colder than January, and the snow did not melt and settle and firm as a normal winter's snow will. It only deepened. The passes were gone, both of them, sealed under 20 and 30 feet of packed drift where the wind had loaded the saddles, and no rider and no team and no man on webs was getting over to the outside world, and the outside world was not getting in. The valley was a shutbox, and in the shutbox, with every horse standing useless in every barn, there was exactly one animal that could still move a load from one place to another, and every soul from the bench to the town knew its name. Samson broke trail to the North homesteads on the Monday, and the flat, where the 2 bachelor brothers were down to eating seed potatoes on the Wednesday. He hauled coal from the mine at it, where a man had a stock of it, up to 3 houses that had run their bins empty. He brought a midwife 4 miles to a berth, and brought her home again. Twice a day, most days, the black ox went out into the killing cold with Elias at his head and someone's need on the sledge behind him. And twice a day he came home and ate his hay in the near stall and rested for the next call. It was not work without its terrors. On a run to the 2 bachelor brothers, in a light so flat and gray that ground and sky were one white nothing, the ox went through the ice. The buried creek had rotted from below, where a spring kept working under the snow, and Samson's off-fore broke through at the lip of it, and he lurched and went down to the brisket in black water and freezing mud. A horse would have thrashed and drowned itself in a minute. The ox stood. He stood in that water, with his breath going up in a slow cloud, and waited, shaking, while Elias came down off the sledge and got to him, talking the whole time, low and even. Steady, steady now. I've got you. He worked a chain around the yoke and back to solid footing, and set the men on the rope. Now Samson, lean, and the ox leaned, one long, terrible pull against the chain and the sucking mud, and Gideon and the 2 brothers hauled with him, and the great animal came up and out onto the packed shelf and stood there steaming and alive. They rubbed him down with sacking and walked him hard to drive the chill out of his soaked legs. He lived. 3 days later he was back in the yoke, and the road went on getting broken, and the haystack behind the barn went down and down. Gideon watched it go as a man watches a candle burn down toward his fingers. He was feeding 40 head of his own, and a working ox that burned feed like a furnace in that cold, and every trip that ox made for a neighbor was hay he'd never get back. He began to measure the winter not in weeks, but in forkfuls. He walked out one gray afternoon and looked at what was left of the tall August rick, a low sad heap of it now, and did the arithmetic one more time, and the arithmetic said that if the winter ran long he would come up short, and cattle would die, and they might be his. He was standing there with that in his hands when the rider came off the town road, who wasn't a rider at all, but a man half dead on webs. And the man was the storekeeper's boy from Larkspur, and he had a message that changed the size of everything. The town was in trouble. Larkspur sat where the freight road came down the valley from the outside, and the freight road had been buried since the first storm, and the town had been living on what was on its shelves the day the snow came. The autumn's last freight string had been caught out on that road when the first storm came down, the teamsters cutting their horses loose and walking the final miles into town on foot. And the loaded wagons stood abandoned where they had stalled. 3 of them, buried to the canvas a few miles out, full of the winter's flour and coal oil and coal. It was all out there. It had been out there the whole time, close enough to curse at and too deep in the drifts to reach. Now the shelves in town were bare. There was no more flour, and no more coal oil, and no more coal. And the sick had begun, first the old and then the children. A fever going house to house through a town that had burned its fences for heat and eaten down to its last barrel. There was help, and there was no reaching it. There was a doctor 11 miles out on the Far Ranch Road who could not get in. And there were sick children in Larkspur who could not get out. And between the town and the help was nothing but snow to the second-story windows, and 1 black ox on the whole of the valley floor that could cross it. They sent me to find the Mercer ox, the boy said, sitting by the stove with his hands wrapped around a cup he could barely hold. The whole town sent me. Folks said if it's true, if there's a beast that can break the freight road, then that's the only chance the little ones have got. He looked up, ashamed and desperate at once. Some of the ones that sent me are the same ones that wouldn't open a door to your man there in October. I'm to say that too. They told me to say it. The room was quiet. The fire ticked. Naomi held her daughter and looked at her husband. Elias Kane had been shut out of every door in that valley on the night his child was born. He had traded away the only thing he owned to a stranger to keep his wife from birthing in a frozen wagon, while 11 miles of warm houses kept their doors barred against him. He had reason, if a man ever had reason, to let the valley freeze. He stood up and reached for his coat. "Yoke him," he said. "We'll want to start before the moon's down. It'll take all the light there is, and then some." They broke the freight road to Larkspur over 2 brutal days. It was 11 miles, and every mile of it was the worst the winter had. The wind had loaded the valley floor into long, hard ridges with soft troughs between, and the ox packed the ridges and swam the troughs, and where the drifts stood higher than the sledge, Elias quartered him at them. Back and come again. Back and come again. Cutting a shelf and climbing it, hour on hour, while Gideon and 2 men from the north bench walked the load and dug the sledge free when it dropped, and threw their own shoulders against the back of it. They spent the night between the 2 days in a half-buried line shack out on the flat, the 3 men and the ox crowded into the one small room, a fire of broken fence rail throwing up more smoke than heat. Gideon thawed a can of beans against the coals, and they passed it hand to hand. "You could have let it freeze," Gideon said into the dark. "The town. After what they did to your wife in October." Elias was a long while answering. The ox shifted and blew in the corner. "My girl was born under your roof because you opened a door," Elias said at last. "I'll not let some other man's girl die because I wanted to keep a grudge warm. That is not a thing I could carry the rest of my life." He drew his coat closer around him. "And it is not my ox to spend or spare any more. It is yours. I only walk at his head." Gideon looked at him across the low red coals and did not say what he was thinking, which was that the ox had stopped being any one man's property a good while back and had quietly become the valley's, and that near the same thing had happened to the 2 of them. The ox never lunged and never quit. He leaned into the dead pull for a full slow minute, at a time where a horse would have spent its heart in seconds, and he took his rest when they gave it, and then he leaned into it again. He was the engine of the whole valley now, and he pulled like he had all winter to do it in. On the last leg they swung wide, off the buried freight road, and out along the Far Ranch Road, and took up the doctor at his own gate 11 miles from town, and brought him in on the sledge behind the ox, over the only trail open to him. A few miles short of the town, the freight road gave up what Larkspur had been starving for. The 3 stalled freight wagons stood where the teamsters had abandoned them in October, drifted to the canvas bows, and the men dug down to the beds of them, and broke the frozen lashings, and loaded onto the sledge what it would carry: sacked flour and tinned coal oil, and all the coal they could stack, off the dead wagons, and onto the packed track the ox had made. The winter's stores had sat out there the whole while, a few miles from the bare shelves that needed them, waiting on nothing in the world but a road wide enough to bring them in. Now there was a road. They came into Larkspur in the last light of the second day, and the town came out into the snow to meet the black ox, as people come out to meet a train that carries their reason to hope. The doctor stepped down off the sledge stiff with cold, and went to the sick that same hour. Behind the doctor came the first flour, and the first coal any house in Larkspur had seen in 2 months. And behind that, over the following week, over the track that one animal kept open with his own weight and his own patience, came the rest. The fever broke in the town because the doctor got in. The doctor got in because the road got broken. The road got broken because a penniless drifter, refused at every door, had once handed a hard rancher a rope and said, "Take my ox and let my wife birth indoors." The valley counted its life that winter in the trips a black ox could make, and it did not forget who had given him away, or who had chosen to pay the feed to keep him working, or that the two of them went out into the worst of it together, again and again, for people who had shut their doors. Spring came as it comes to high country, all at once and violent, the creeks roaring under rotten ice, and the drifts going gray and sinking overnight. The passes opened in April. The outside world came back into the valley, and the valley by then was a changed place, thinner and quieter, having buried some of its old, and having pulled most of its young through by a margin no wider than the track of a sledge. Gideon Mercer came up short on hay, in the end, just as his arithmetic had promised. He lost cattle. 9 head of his 40 went down in the last hard stretch of March when the rick gave out, and he stood in the mud of the thaw and counted the loss, and knew exactly what it had cost him to keep that ox on the road all winter. He would tell anyone who asked that it was the best trade he ever made. Elias and Naomi did not go back to the trail. Gideon asked them to stay before the passes even opened, asked it plain across the same stove they'd all crouched around the night the baby came. And Elias said yes, and they built onto the west end of the house that summer 2 more rooms, and the drifter who had owned nothing but an ox became a partner on a ranch that owed its neighbors nothing, and was owed by half the valley. The valley made it right in its own slow fashion. When the grass came, the Renfros drove over 2 wagon loads of wild hay cut from their bottom meadow and stacked it in Gideon's empty rick, without being asked. The North Bench brothers came and helped him gather what was left of his herd off the high ground. Larkspur, that had barred its doors against a laboring woman in October, found 100 small ways through the summer to keep the Mercer place in its debt. None of it gave Gideon back the 9 head he had lost. He never expected that it would. Some prices a man pays and does not get returned, and the paying is the point. The baby they named Ada. She grew up on that place riding the broad patient back of the ox her father had given away, and her mother had birthed within sound of, and she never once in her life understood why grown men in Larkspur would go quiet and take their hats off when that old black ox came slow down the street, long after he was too old to pull anything at all. But the grown men knew. They knew that the winter the passes closed for 100 days, when every horse in the valley stood useless in the dark of the barns, and the town ate down to its barrels, and the children took fever behind buried doors. The whole of it, every life that came out the far side of that winter, had hung on one animal walking slow into the snow, and that the animal had come into the valley on a rope in a stranger's hand, offered up freely, on the coldest night of the year, by a man with nothing left to give but the last thing he owned. Gideon Mercer lived a long time after. He never spoke much, as he'd never spoken much. But once, an old man, he was asked by a boy who did not know the story why he'd taken in a drifter and a laboring woman on a killing night, when a wiser man would have kept his door shut and his hay for his own. He thought about it a while, as he thought about everything. Because he offered me the only thing he had, Gideon said. And a man who will do that, on his worst night, for the smallest mercy, is a man worth freezing beside. He looked out at the pasture, where somewhere in the green a black ox was buried under a stone. I gambled 40 head of cattle on it, lost 9, and I'd hand him the same hay again tomorrow, and the day after, and every day this valley had breath in it. The stranger paid the whole price first, on the doorstep, before he knew what any of it would buy. That is the part people forget when they tell it now. He did not trade the ox for what the ox turned out to be worth. He could not have known. No one could. He gave away everything he owned for one warm corner and one safe hour for the woman he loved, and asked nothing back. And it was only the winter, grinding down on all of them, that turned that gift into the thread the whole valley hung its life on. Take my ox, he had said, into the dark and the snow, with the last of what he had held out at the end of a rope, and by winter that ox was the only hope the valley had.